We're continuing on in Ephesians now, Ephesians 6, 1 through 3. Just a reminder to you that we, for the previous months, had been looking at what was kind of, I suppose, in one sense of the word, kind of a key transition phrase in Ephesians 5:21 that said, submitting yourselves one to another in the fear of God. You'll remember in Ephesians 5:18 that he gave us a command, an imperative command, be ye filled with the Spirit. One of the things that be ye filled with the Spirit means is to be submitted unto God, because no man can be filled with the Spirit except he be submitted unto God. Then he gets more specific with it, saying, submitting yourselves one to another. The importance of honoring and respecting the people that are around us, because we recognize that all people have been made in the image of God. And because they've been made in the image of God, their value or their worth is not attached to how strong they are or how well they run or how well they walk or any kind of track meets that they might win or anything like that. It's not attached to anything physically that is done. Instead, it's attached simply to this fact that each person has been made in the image of God, and that each person, and I'm just thankful to say, in here we have many different people, but every single one of you represents a person for whom Jesus Christ shed his blood for. He shed his blood for each one. And it's not in regard to intelligence or lack thereof. It's not in regard to physical endurance or lack thereof, frailty, whatever. It's not dependent upon all of that. It's simply that you yourself have incredible worth to God, so much so that he gave his Son to die on the cross for you. For you. Okay, now, having said that, it kind of helps set the stage. The rest of chapter 5 dealt with the husband-wife relationship. Then in chapter 6, verses 1 through 3, we have something that is profoundly important. And the very first word there is just children, obey your parents. I just want to take a few moments to say to you, how important is childhood? I hope that you would say, wow, Pastor, I think that it's just super important. That one of the reasons maybe that our church had Vacation Bible School this past week is because children have tremendous importance, and teaching them from the preschool level about the foundations of God loves them, caring place, etc., teaching them all the way through their teen years about God's plan for their lives. All of that's important because every single one of them is important to God. Now, this helps to build a foundation. What God has intended is that you and I learn lessons in our childhood that serve us the rest of our lives. I don't know if Debbie would have this quote ready at the top of her head. She'd probably come closer to it than I would. But somebody said, 90% of what I learned by the time I was in kindergarten. That's pretty interesting observation, especially for those of us who may have been in some advanced graduate programs. And you think, oh, wow. And yet it's so easy to overlook the many profound things that are learned in those first 5 to 6 years of life. Amazing. So truly incredible. But anyway, so let's look at God's design for the family. Some wise family counsel here for us. He starts off simply with children. Obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. What is this then about God's design? Well, God's design is very different for man than it is, for instance, for an ostrich. An ostrich will lay an egg or two or whatever, and perhaps even at some point abandon that egg, and the little ostrich is born and doesn't learn a whole lot from its parents, learns a little bit differently. But for children, we know that parents are so important. It's the way God designed us. I don't know why this is, but in God's design, it takes a human being, and it depends on who you ask. I don't know. I just have a feeling that if I asked Belle, maybe, or Shelby, if I asked one of them, they might say, well, I think, it takes about 12 or 13 years to grow up. Then I think there are some others that you might ask, and they might say, well, really it takes about 21 years for a person to grow up. And then, there are some of us that if I were to ask Matt Young's mother, she'd probably say, honey, it took Matthew 50 years to grow up. Well, you get the idea. It takes a while. Animals are not that way. In fact, no other creature is like man, because God made man different from the animals. God made man as his special, unique creation, made in the image of God. So we have this command, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. A couple of things that I'll point out to you from the beginning. One is that this is instructions not only for children, but also for parents, and even more than that. As a matter of fact, understanding God's design for the family ought to be of priority importance to every civil institution in America, in our nation. Because understanding God's design for the family is intricately involved in every other civil institution. Now, we'll say the family was God's first institution that he had here upon the earth. Okay, the family. It is foundational to everything else. You're going to see it more and more as we go along. And so every civil institution needs to take into account the family. One of the ways that our country has gone so far astray today is that we have begun many years ago to belittle the priority or the importance of the family. Decisions made impact the family in various ways, and always the impact upon the family needs to be considered with every decision that is made. Well, let's look a little bit further at it then. Verse 1 really deals with the actions. It deals with actions. Children, obey your parents in the Lord. This is talking about obedience, about the outward actions of children as they're growing up. Their outward actions need to be the actions of obedience. And I'll note to you that there is nothing said about whether these are imperfect or perfect parents. I know for many people, the idea of submission is something that say, well, there's not anybody that is of high enough standing, really, to submit to. As some of our people who've been in the military might know, there are many in higher positions of authority that may not have the background or may not have the credibility of wearing the stripes that they wear, but if they got the stripes, you know how you need to act with them. You just understand that. So many today would just say, well, the Bible can't be right when it says, children, obey your parents, because my parents are a mess. And there are a multitude of parents today that are indeed a mess. But it's not referencing whether they're perfect or imperfect. Instead, it says simply, children, obey your parents, for this is right. Now, we learn as we grow up, we learn the different ways. In fact, it's almost funny, I suppose, and I don't want to get to this slide yet, but as Debbie and I have 27 3/4, I think now, grandchildren. And we have certainly learned a lot this kind of second time. First time around is raising your own kids. And you learn from raising your own kids, right? Steep learning curve, learn a lot. Well, second time around with grandkids, you learn more. And you observe more. And you, wow, this is really, didn't realize this when our kids were going through this stage, didn't realize quite what it was like. But you learn. Some of the things that you learn is that you learn that really, in one sense, the preschool life is all about learning to control yourself. But for many kids today, it's learning to control others. Just let that sink in for a little while. The control yourself is learning to gain control over your muscles so that you're able to crawl and then walk. Learning how to gain control of your lips and your tongue and your breathing so that you can start talking. Learning control of such things as when you don't get your way, don't throw your little temper tantrum. Learning things, just learning a variety of things like that is what those preschool years ought to be. But for many, and you see it especially in today's world, for a lot of kids, it's really more than anything else. It's really about how to manipulate and control other people, how to get your way. I want what I want when I want it. And if anybody's going to stand in my way, I'll just throw the biggest temper tantrum, and people will be glad to give me whatever I wanted just to get me to stop. Oh, you might think kids don't learn that, but most of them do. All right, the actions here are the actions of learning to be obedient. We learn as a child, we ought to learn, we may or may not do this, but we ought to learn in that process the value of wise appeals. Folks, listen, when the Bible says submit, know also that the Bible has a lot to say about how to make wise appeals to others. We need to learn that as a child. Now, children tend to learn not so much wise appeals as they learn how to manipulate others. It's always a fascinating lesson to watch 4 or 5 preschool grandchildren at one time and learn how the things that they do and say in order to influence the others that are around them. It is really just, it's really just fascinating. I think that maybe the reason Debbie schedules different appointments sometimes during the day is so I can go back to school and learn with our grandkids some of those lessons again through what they do, through watching them. Well, one of the things that we learn then is the value of wise appeals, and that is how to appeal to one who is supposed to be an authority in your life when they ask you to do what is wrong or when they're doing something that's wrong. The tremendous value of learning, because, folks, that is how all of life is. Do you expect everyone in life to treat you right and to treat you justly? Well, if you expect that, you're in for a lot of letdown and disappointment. Because people, even being a Christian doesn't mean that everyone's going to treat you right. But some people think that when you're a Christian, everybody will treat you right, and then when they're not treated right, they begin to get bitter about it, resentful. etc. Listen, life's not fair. People aren't fair to you. Whether you talk about boss, or whether you talk about family, or whether you talk about church, or whether you talk about community, whatever it is that you talk about, people aren't always fair. You see, we learn in the laboratory of our family, with our siblings and others, we learn about that. And we ought to learn, and it's really another whole message about wise appeals. There's much to be said, and much that Scripture does say about it. Folks, the fact of the matter is, it's as a child that we learn to be responsible. We learn about responsibility. Responsibility is knowing and doing what God and others expect of me. And we've been spending some time on that the past few years, looking at responsibility and recognizing that God and others have those things that they desire from us, that they expect from us to do. And we look at how do we fulfill the responsibilities that we have. Some people think that being a leader means that people are going to serve you. Folks, that's not what it means at all. Being a leader means that there are those people that you seek to serve because you look at their expectations and you seek to be able to serve those. Zig Ziglar commented, and his comment I thought was so rich. He says, though I'm not always responsible for what happens to me, I am responsible for how I handle what happens to me. Profound lesson for children to learn. I'm not always responsible, that is, my home may be broken. My mother or father may be addicted to some substance of some type. There may be, and you just go on and on and on with all the things that it may happen in a household. And look, you're not always responsible. And as a child, you're not responsible for those things that happen, but you are responsible for how you handle what happens to you. That's responsibility. And that's what needs to be learned as we're growing up within our family. It's interesting just to think about it and to just say, hey, some people have bad things happen to them, become very bitter and mean-spirited. Other people have bad things happen to them and they become very great in leadership for Christ. What is that difference? It's all in a person's response, not to the things that have happened to them. Boy, I just hope that makes sense to you. Years and years ago, Debbie and I were at a Sunday school conference at Ridgecrest when Dr. Adrian Rogers was the camp pastor. Adrian Rogers is one of my most favorite preachers. I enjoyed him to no end. Anyway, I wondered, his preaching had such an impact upon me. It just seemed so powerful. And I wondered about, how does a person become like that? Later in the camp experience, he shared one of the things that helped to mold his life. And he shared about the little child that they had that died. And the devastation that was for he and for his wife. God uses things. How we respond is so important. And so the disappointments that come as we're growing up, sometimes the tough situations. Some of you grew up in foster homes. And maybe you feel resentment towards God because, God, why would you let my mother or my father abandon me? God, why did you let them die? God, why did this happen? God, why did that happen? And hey, just a reminder to you, you're not responsible for the things that have happened to you, but you are responsible for how you handle those things. And know this, that God's grace is sufficient. It is enough to help you handle anything and everything that comes your way. Amen. Oh, that is the grace of God. Marvelous grace of Jesus. Can I just tell you a little bit about that marvelous grace real quick? that marvelous grace is, as bad as many homes are today, as difficult as many children have it growing up, I want you to know, I want you to hear this. The grace of Jesus is sufficient to bring them through it and help them shine as a result of it. Well, there are so many other things that could be said about that. Let me leave that spot, though, for a moment with this last thought about actions. I'm not sure who it was that did this quote, but I copied it and have saved it for years and years. And I thought, I just need to share that with people. In fact, an accurate description of children is that they are little people who are out of control of themselves and attempting to control everyone around them. Oh, there's something to that, isn't there? And I know some of you've got big hearts. You say, oh, Pastor Keith, how could anybody talk so bad about little preschoolers? Okay, we're just going to go on. Hey, verse 2 and 3 really deals with attitudes. It moves from actions now. Children, obey your parents. It moves from the outward actions and it moves to the inner attitudes. Notice there in verse 2, honor thy father and mother. Honor thy father and mother. The word for honor there is a similar word would be the word respect. Respect, give honor, give respect to your father and mother. Now, I know that in our day, there have been so many broken families, and many of you have shared testimonies. I know that there are many, many broken families represented right here in this sanctuary right now. And you wonder, how do I respect my father and mother when this or that or whatever, these things happen? How am I supposed to respect them? It's similar in so many ways to so many other things in life. In so much of life, we have to learn to respect the position, though we may not respect the personality. It's true every time you get pulled over by a law enforcement officer. By the way, has anybody here never been pulled over a single time by a law enforcement officer? Just raise your hand right now. I'd like to recognize you. Anybody here that's never been pulled? We're full of lawbreakers in here. I wasn't quite expecting that. Bev, I did see your hand. I did see your hand. Yes, okay. But it was almost unanimous. 99% of the people of Edgewood Baptist Church have had interactions with law enforcement officers that they've been pulled over. That's kind of a startling statistic. I don't know if we should have, I don't know, Scott, can you go back and edit that out of our Facebook feed? Scrub it. Whoa. Anyway, hey folks, I know this, and you know this too. All law enforcement officers do not have the best personality. Some of them have terrible personalities. And it's hard to not react to the personality. But I hope that you've also realized that you respect the position of law enforcement, even if you have disagreements with their personality. Can I say the same thing about every branch of life? In your family, you may not respect the personality of some of your siblings, but you need to honor them. You may not respect the personality of your mom or your dad. You may not respect the addictive part of their personality, their imperfections, whatever, but you need to honor them, honor the position. You may or may not respect some of the elected officials, but you need to honor the position and not run down the personality, but instead honor the position. You may or may not have personality clashes with your boss, but you need to honor the fact that they are your boss. So you kind of catch the idea. This is dealing with attitudes now. And as children, one of the things that needs to be trained for is this attitude, having this attitude of respect. I think it's really good to say that for most people, this respect factor, it starts at home. Now, schools, public schools, private schools alike throughout our country have had to really get into character education. Character education is a reality in most school districts now, even though oftentimes it's kind of overlooked. It's stated publicly, but it's overlooked privately because teachers are so busy with so many other things that they have to do. But there's a recognition or an acknowledgement at least that says, look, character has to be taught. If kids are not getting taught at home about respect and about responsibility, then they're going to have to be taught at school, because how can you have good citizenry if we don't learn respect and responsibility? You have to have it. Well, it does indeed start at home. Billy Graham, I don't know if everybody would say a great theologian, but certainly a great preacher, pastor, a man of God. Billy Graham said, a child who's allowed to be disrespectful to his parents will not have true respect for anyone. Well, a pretty profound statement, but you see how it's just an illustration really of what I'm saying. The home is where you learn about respect, and the Bible says, honor thy father and mother. There is this profound lesson to be learned that the home is to teach. You probably only have to talk to one or two public educators. I'll reference you to Donna Linus. You talk to her and ask her about it. But if the kids haven't learned respect at home, when they come to school, they don't respect principals, they don't respect teachers, they don't respect other students. They've got to learn it. And so that's why the scripture says, honor thy father and thy mother. That attitude is just such a huge deal. And in today's culture, that attitude is so disrespected. Can I say it that way? The attitude of respect is disrespected. In fact, much of what goes on in our country when it comes to law enforcement, the defund of the police and all of those things, folks, one way to look at it is just to ask this question. Have the people that are having these terrible run-ins with police officers, have they learned respect at home? And probably most of the reading that you've done would say to you, no, they haven't. And folks, if people haven't learned respect at home, they're going to disrespect law enforcement, and they're going to disrespect others in authority. That's how it's going to be. So it has to be addressed. And Christian parents ought to really be aware of this need. Well, let me go further than attitudes. Let me go to family blessing, because note the last part of verse 2 and the first part of verse 3. This is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with thee, and that thou mayest live long on the earth. Listen, the city will rejoice when the righteous rule. The city will rejoice when the citizenry are raising their children to understand their responsibility of respecting others. First commandment with promise, what a profound promise it is. Out of all the other things that go on in life, Paul's saying, look, if you learn to respect, to honor your father and mother, and children obey your parents, if that is learned, it may be well with you, and that you may live long upon the earth. It's talking about a stable culture, a stable society, and that's what it does. Well, one of the ways to look about this and to learn about this, if you want a Christian book to read that would help you with this, is Dr. John Townsend and Dr. Henry Cloud. They've done a series of books about boundaries. Again, you might see Donna Lena. She has several of those books. She's taught about boundaries and things, and I'd say just see Donna as a resource person. What about this thing, boundary? Boundaries is a wonderful tool for teaching the biblical principles of responsibilities. Here's a simple definition. Boundary. Boundary is a property line that defines a person. It defines where one person ends and someone else begins. Property line. You know how a property line is, I think. I need to pick on somebody's yard. I would pick on Brother Art's yard, but they live out in the middle of nowhere. So I don't. Do you even have a neighbor next to your property? I guess you do, but not really. Somebody in town. I don't know who. Anyway, if you just picture somebody in town and they don't have a fence line between them. Fence line doesn't mark their property. And so they mow the grass. And one neighbor may blow his heavy clippings over onto the other neighbor. How's that? Neighbor might resent that a little bit. Might be upset by that a little bit. Have you ever had a neighbor that's been... No, I don't want to ask that. But you get the picture, I hope. Or maybe you have a tree that grows on his side and it begins to branch over onto your side, and you think about it, and you think about, it's an apple tree and it's got some really good looking fruit. Is it yours because it's over on your side? I don't know the law. I have no idea. So you go out and harvest everything on your side? Or does the neighbor get angry with you because you're picking from his tree? I don't know what the boundary line is in that example. I don't know. But I hope you can get the picture. Learning boundaries is learning your property line. That is, my responsibilities go to here. And then from there on, it's not my responsibility. Do you know most problems that people experience with others is because they take responsibilities that are not theirs, that they feel like they're responsible. I don't know. Do you ever feel like, I don't know if I should ask this or not. I'll go ahead. Do you ever feel like, Pastor Keith, I don't really like the sermons you've been preaching here lately. I think you need to preach on, let me give you 3 or 4 sermon subjects for you to preach on. Now, I'm just going to say to you, that person has left their area of responsibility. That's not their responsibility. They've left it. But they may experience great anguish over trying to get that accomplished. A teacher that may not teach exactly what you want to hear. So many things that happen where a person feels like, well, this is how it ought to be. No, listen. That's not your responsibility. You're not responsible for that. You need to excel in your responsibilities. That's the boundary for you. Too many of us are preschoolers in adult clothing. That's right. We go around life seeking to control our sons, our daughters, our siblings, our parents, our whatever. Now, I know people tend to call those people control freaks or something like that. But you catch the idea, I hope. Where does my responsibility end and someone else has that responsibility. Okay, there's a lot that can be learned from that, some fascinating concepts there. Helen Keller said, and you guys recognize Helen Keller's name, I hope. Helen Keller, blind, deaf, multiple handicaps. She said, I'm only one, but still I am one. I cannot do everything, but still I can do something. I will not refuse to do something I can do. Another way of saying that is, I'm only one. I'm not responsible for the world. I'm only one. There are certain things I'm responsible for, and I will take care of my responsibilities without getting too worked up about everybody else's responsibilities. When you think about witnessing to people, when you think about your children, witnessing to your children, you want, you pray, you hope, and you work that your children are going to become Christians and that they're not going to turn, temporary stupidity when they become older teenagers, young adults. You hope and pray that. However, you also have to recognize that your responsibility only goes so far. They have choices that they make that they're responsible for. You can't force your child, your adult child, your teenage child. You can't force your child to turn to Christ. Your responsibility is to be a faithful witness. Can you force your neighbor to become a Christian? Of course not. But you can pray for them. What is your responsibility? Pray. Witness when I have the opportunity. Yes, that's my responsibility. But I can't make them become a Christian. Not my responsibility. Understanding this is just so profound. I just want to share a piece of great news with you. Wherever you're at in life, you can start anew through Jesus Christ. Wherever you're at in life, you can start anew. You may look at yourself and you may say, hey, I just don't feel like I've really done very good with my responsibilities. I've always tried to control other people, and that's just kind of how I've been. Or maybe you've been a very non-assertive person, and you say, I've resented the fact that others don't do right, and it makes me angry and it makes me bitter and this or that. But hey, what have you done about your own responsibilities? That's where it's at. That's where the action is. Look at myself and my responsibilities. First of all, no matter what kind of home you grew up in, you might be angry with God and say, if there's a God, why would God have allowed my mother to be an alcoholic her whole life? And why would God have allowed all these terrible things to have happened when I was growing up? Etc. Or you might say, God, I don't understand why these things happen. But I do understand that Jesus is for me. My responsibility is to respond to Christ. And then Jesus Christ is able to take my life and make something beautiful out of it. That's what he wants to do. So I just want to ask you, where are you at in life? Maybe you didn't learn when you were younger. Maybe you did not learn responsibility or respect, either one. But you realize today how important it is. You can only do so much. Let's do what we can do. And I just want to say, hey, let's start that with a relationship with Jesus Christ. Have you come to the point in your life where you've repented of your sin and turned to Jesus Christ in faith for him to forgive you and for him to be the leader of your life? Have you done that yet?